Marie Batiste reminds us, too, that educational institutions were ultimately designed by privileged deciders and were not done so for the benefit of race or class groups, which are marginalized. The question of how we define knowledge and who we perceive capable of holding knowledge also emerges here. There are many politics surrounding systems of knowledge, and they help to perpetuate existing systems of oppression in our society. Batiste argues that cognitive imperialism is at play in our educational systems, and those systems are working to legitimize and reinforce certain ways of knowing. They're also controlling how knowledge is diffused ultimately. So certain experiences and perceptions are devalued in this system, like those of marginalized classes, such as youth experiencing poverty or homelessness. This perceived inequality that Batiste talks of is rooted in racial and cultural minorities in Canada being led to believe that they are at a disadvantage because of their racialized status, instead of because of systemic issues rooted in this capitalistic power relation. Batiste tells us that we as educators must avoid using education to privilege one way of knowing, which in Canada's context is deeply rooted in Eurocentric theories and perspective, and neglects altogether other cultures and experiences. She too reminds us that ultimately education is, quote, neither cultural, neutral, nor fair, end quote. Students who identify as a member of an Indigenous culture or other racialized group underrepresented in Canada can also begin to feel disengaged in Canadian school systems because they don't feel that the curriculum addresses their identity, their place in Canadian society, or their needs. The same is true for students who are further marginalized by their experiences of poverty. Further, this educational system of privilege can lead to the internalization of this belief that poverty is the student's own fault because it's not an experience considered normal, it's not explored by our curriculum, or furthermore, that their poverty may directly be tied to their race, identity, and a position of powerlessness and shame. This ongoing stress created by poverty and homelessness creates a cycle of oppression, like we see in theories of intergenerational trauma and ethno-stress. Certain stresses, negativity, depression, and so on can become chronic and ultimately can be perpetuated through generations. In youth experiencing poverty and homelessness, these possible feelings of hopelessness and shame we've talked about previously could be hardwired and passed down to offspring through genetic codes. In the article on the conditions and effects of ethnostress, we're reminded that a strong sense of self-identity and understanding cannot be cultivated and furthermore passed on to generations in an environment of insecurity. This is not only true for Indigenous communities being discussed in this article, but it extends to youth marginalized by poverty and homelessness who can't necessarily obtain these basic needs that act as a foundation for building a sense of identity. This failure to navigate our beliefs about identity and our family and early childhood stress concerning inherited confusion and pain does carry on into adulthood, since it's often left unresolved and unaddressed by our societal systems and institutions, which are only working to sustain dynamics of power and oppression.